Hi, my name is Mary Powell Periado, and in this session, we'll be discussing Altman's multivariate analysis for public and private companies. So earlier in this unit, we discussed corporate distress, that is a situation of financial hardship being experienced by companies. Now, upon completion of this session, you should be able to evaluate the various elements of Altman's multivariate model and also perform the stress prediction for both private and public companies. And we made mention that in situations where a firm is in distress, it could be seen or you can identify signs of distress in terms of their operating activities, their financial activities, their books of accounts and other areas. Now you can say a company is in distress when they have or when their total assets is unable to meet their total liability obligations. Now, there are other factors that can reveal a situation of corporate distress, and all this would be analyzed using the Altman's multivariate model. So, distress prediction plays a very significant role when it comes to the survival of companies, especially in the long run. So in this session, we'll use the Altman's multivariate model to predict the distress levels of both public companies and private companies. Now, the Altman's multivariate model, as the name implies, was developed by Edward Altman, who was born in 1941, and he was a professor of Finance in New York University Stern School of Business. Now, he is best known for the development of this Z score that is used to predict the bankruptcy level or the distress levels of companies. Altman selected 5 ratios that he deemed as best predictors of corporate distress using 33 firms, okay, and he classified these firms according to if they are failed or bankrupt or they are distressed or not, or if they're in the gray zone, which would require more thorough examination. Now, the purpose of these 5 ratios he selected are, done to in order to measure 5 key areas of the firm in terms of one, liquidity position, 2, reinvestment, 3, profitability, 4, financial leverage, and also 5, the sales generating ability of firms, which are key predictors or indicators of the financial performance of companies. So now when it comes to the ultimate discriminant function, we have the z-score, which is a function of the 5 indicators of the five the 5 ratios that were chosen by Edward Altman, and they all have coefficients. So when it comes to the first one, which measures the liquidity position, it has, which is X1, that's the ratio of working capital to total assets. It has a coefficient of 1.2. When it comes to reinvestments, which is the ratio of retained earnings to total assets, it has a coefficient of 1.4. And X3, which is the ratio of earnings before interest and taxes to total assets and measures profitability, it has a coefficient of 3.3. And also when it comes to the market value of equity and preference shares to book value of total debt, that is a measure of financial leverage of firms, it also has a coefficient of 0.6. And the X5, which measures the sales generating ability of the firm using the ratio of sales to total assets, it has a coefficient of 1.0. Now, this particular z-score with these coefficients is used to measure is used to conduct a multivariate analysis for public companies. Now, that of private companies have different coefficients, which we'll look at in some few slides to come. So when it comes to the first element, which is X1, that measures liquidity, you realize that working capital is just the difference between your current assets and your current liabilities. So in situations where the firm is incurring or having operating losses, it would cause the current assets of the firm to shrink, and that would be shown in when or it will be shown when this particular ratio is calculated. Also, when it comes to X2, which is the measure of reinvestment, the amount of retained earnings to total assets shows the cumulative profitability of the firm over time. Now you realize that this particular ratio may be biased in cases when you are dealing with relatively young firms because they haven't had enough time to accumulate a lot of earnings. But you have when you have an older firm, let's say a firm that's 20 to 30 years old, you're expecting that that firm has made enough earnings within those years and therefore they have retained some. If you have a firm that is relatively old but then has a lower ratio, that shows that the firm is not really reinvesting in the company, and that is also a sort of a negative signal because it means that much of the earnings that are made by the company are not reinvested into the company, and that means a lot of cash is leaving the company, and that would be a cause of concern for various stakeholders. Also, when it comes to earning before interest and taxes to total assets, that is X3, and a measure of profitability. It is used to show the true productivity of the firm's assets. So you are able to tell how productive or efficient the firm is, how the ability of the firm to be efficient and to make more profit or earnings, generate more sales. Abstracting or not regarding any taxes or leverages that the company has. In terms of taxes, I mean its obligations to the government to pay part of its income to it for developmental purposes or to generate revenue for the government. And interest has to do with the leverage the firm gets in cases where it has borrowed funds, okay, in its capital structure. Now, X4 is the market value of equity to the book value of total debt. And since we are dealing with public companies, we are talking about market value. So this measures how much the firm's assets can decline in value before the liabilities exceed the assets and the firm becomes insolvent. So you'd want to know that in worst case scenarios, if your assets as a firm is declining, how long will it take for your firm to become insolvent? So at what point would it be that the assets of the firms will not be enough to settle its liabilities? Also, the fifth element, which is X5, is this determines the sales generating ability of the firm. So it measures the ability of management in order to deal with competitive situations. So earlier in the very first unit and session, we made mention that there are economic conditions and there are also industrial conditions. And when we take the Michael Porter's 5 forces, we know that businesses operate in a very competitive environment, and therefore as a business you need to have comparative advantage or competitive advantage in order for you to make enough economic profit. So the sales to total assets measures the ability of the firm to generate more sales and also its ability to deal with competitive conditions when it comes to the making of sales or generating of sales using the assets of the company. So when it comes to the analysis of the values obtained from Altman's multivariate model, we use the Z-score. Now, when you have a Z-score that is greater than 2.99, it means that the firm is not experiencing any financial difficulties. In other words, the firm has a sound liquidity position and also a very good solvency position. However, if the Z-score is less than 1.81, it means the firm is in financial distress, or the firm is a distressed or a failed firm, or in other words, they are experiencing financial difficulties and they are not in good financial position or financial standing. However, you may have firms that are not failed or not distressed, and they are also not really in good financial standing, you'd have them having a Z score between 1.81 and 2.99. So they are not less than 1.81, but then they are also not greater than 2.99. So such firms would require further investigation to determine their actual solvency status and their real financial position or financial condition. So earlier on, we discussed that the earlier model we mentioned was for public companies. Now, Osman has a separate model for private companies, which can be seen using the coefficients of the various elements. So in terms of the private companies, the very first element, which measures the liquidity position, has a coefficient of 0.717. The second element, which measures reinvestment, has a coefficient of 0.847. The third element, which is X2E, which measures profitability, has a coefficient of 3.107, which can be seen to be the highest here. And when it comes to X4, which measures financial leverage, it has a coefficient of 0.420. And the very last one, which is the sales generating ability, has a coefficient of 0.998. Now, the analysis of the Z score for private companies is that when the Z score is greater than 2.9, then the company is in the safe zone. In other words, they are not experiencing any financial hardship or distress, and therefore they have very sound liquidity and solvency positions. When the company's Z or when the Z score is less than 1.23, then it means the firm is distressed or having financial hardship. I mean, in terms of private companies. But when it is between 1.23 and 2.9, the private companies are also in the gray zone, and therefore they will need further investigation to determine whether or not they are in good financial standing or liquidity position and solvency position or not. So in this session, we discussed how to predict the stress levels for both public and private companies using Altman's multivariate model, and also how to interpret the Z score for the various types of companies, whether public companies or private companies. Thank you.